So, here's the thing about love. No one tells you it might involve wiping drool off someone's chin or learning how to operate a wheelchair like you're training for the Paralympics. But let me back up. It all started with Ethan and his brilliant idea to show off his parkour skills. Yes, parkour. Because apparently, leaping off walls and doing flips in public is a totally normal thing for a 28-year-old man to do. I should have known better, but hey, love makes you stupid. The day of the accident was, ironically, one of those perfect days. You know, the kind where the sun is shining, birds are chirping, and you're thinking, wow, life is great. Spoiler alert, life was not great. We were at the park, and Ethan decided to impress me by jumping off a picnic table. He'd been watching YouTube tutorials for weeks, so naturally he was an expert. I was sitting there, half listening to him explain the physics of a perfect landing when it happened. He slipped on a banana peel. A banana peel. I'm not even kidding. It was like something out of a cartoon. 1 second, he was mid-air, looking like a wannabe action hero, and the next, he was on the ground, groaning in pain. At first, I thought he was just being dramatic. I mean, who actually slips on a banana peel? But then he couldn't move his legs. Cue the panic. I called 911, and the next thing I knew, we were in the back of an ambulance. Ethan looking pale and me trying not to cry, while the paramedic asked me questions like, has he ever had a spinal injury before? Ma'am, I barely know his middle name. The hospital was a blur of fluorescent lights, beeping machines, and doctors using words like vertebrae and spinal cord compression. I sat in the waiting room clutching a cup of coffee that tasted like burnt regret and Googled things like, can you recover from paralysis? Pro tip, don't do that. WebMD will convince you everyone is dying. When the doctor finally came out, he said Ethan had a severe spinal injury and might never walk again. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. The first few days were a nightmare. Ethan was in so much pain and I was completely out of my depth. I didn't know how to be a caregiver. I didn't even know how to fold a hospital gown properly. But I learned. I learned. I became a master of bedpans, a connoisseur of protein shakes, and an expert at pretending everything was fine when it very much wasn't. There were moments of dark humour though, like the time Ethan tried to feed himself and ended up with mashed potatoes in his hair, or the time I accidentally wheeled him into a wall because I was too busy arguing with the GPS on my phone. We laughed, but it was the kind of laughter that teetered on the edge of tears. The hardest part was seeing him so vulnerable. This was the guy who used to carry me up 3 flights of stairs when I pretended to twist my ankle just to be cute. Now, he couldn't even lift a spoon without looking like he was auditioning for a tragic mime performance. It broke my heart, but I told myself we'd get through it. Together. What I didn't realise at the time was that this was just the beginning. The accident was the easy part. The real challenge was everything that came after. But hey, at least I didn't have to worry about him doing parkour anymore. Silver linings, right? After the initial chaos of the accident settled, life became a strange, exhausting routine. I went from being Ethan's girlfriend to his full-time caregiver, cheerleader, and occasional stand-up comedian. My days revolved around his needs, and my nights were spent Googling things like how to prevent bed sores and can you overdose on protein shakes? Answer, probably. It was like I'd signed up for a crash course in nursing, except there was no diploma at the end, just a lot of sweatpants and sleepless nights. Our apartment turned into a makeshift rehab centre. We had a wheelchair parked by the couch, a stack of medical supplies in the bathroom, and a fridge full of meal replacement shakes that tasted like chalk mixed with regret. I became a pro at manoeuvring Ethan's wheelchair through narrow doorways and figuring out how to fold it into the trunk of my car without losing a finger. I even learned how to disassemble and reassemble it like some kind of wheelchair ninja. Who knew I had hidden talents? Ethan's recovery was slow, agonizingly slow. There were days when he made progress, like when he managed to wiggle his toes for the first time, and I cried like I'd just witnessed a miracle. Then there were days when he couldn't even sit up without help, and the frustration would bubble over. He'd snap at me, and I'd snap back, and we'd both end up apologising while I tried not to cry into his protein shake. It wasn't his fault, and it wasn't mine, but that didn't make it any easier. I tried to keep things light, though. Humour became my coping mechanism, like the time I accidentally put too much hot sauce in his soup, and he said it felt like his mouth was on fire. I joked, "Well, at least you can feel something." He groaned, but I saw the corner of his mouth twitch. Small victories. My social life took a nosedive. My friends stopped inviting me to things because I always had to cancel. "Sorry, I can't make it. Ethan has physical therapy," became my default response. Eventually, they stopped asking. I didn't blame them, but it was lonely. My world had shrunk to the size of our apartment, and sometimes it felt like I was disappearing too. Work was another challenge. I was lucky my boss was understanding, but even she had her limits. I'd show up late, leave early, and spend half the day texting Ethan to make sure he was okay. My productivity took a hit, and so did my bank account. Between medical bills and the cost of all the equipment Ethan needed, I was constantly stressed about money. I started cutting corners wherever I could, buying generic brands, skipping my morning latte, and even learning how to cut Ethan's hair myself. Spoiler, I'm not great at it. He looked like a toddler had gone at him with safety scissors. But through it all, I kept telling myself it was temporary. Ethan would recover and we'd get back to normal. I just had to hang in there a little longer. What I didn't realise was that normal was a moving target. Every time we got close, it seemed to slip further away. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get any harder, they did. As the weeks turned into months, the weight of everything started to press down on me like a stack of unpaid medical bills. I was exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally, mentally, spiritually. I felt like a deflated balloon, the kind you find under the couch a week after the party's over. And the worst part? Ethan didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he did, and he just didn't care. Either way, it hurt. I'd wake up early to make sure Ethan had everything he needed before I left for work. His meds, his breakfast, his phone within reach in case he needed me. Then, I'd rush to the office, spend the day pretending I wasn't one missed email away from a full-blown meltdown, and come home to do it all over again. Dinner, physical therapy, exercises, more meds, and then the endless cycle of laundry and cleaning. I was running on fumes. And Ethan? He just kept asking for more. "Can you grab my water? Can you adjust the pillow behind my back? Can you scratch that itch on my foot?" It was always something, and I get it, he was in a tough spot. But sometimes I just wanted to scream, "What about me? Who's taking care of me?" Instead, I'd plaster on a smile and say, "Sure, no problem," like some kind of martyr in yoga pants. The resentment started to creep in, little by little. I'd find myself glaring at him while he slept, wondering how he could look so peaceful while my life was falling apart. Then, I'd feel guilty and remind myself that none of this was his fault. But the guilt didn't make the resentment go away. It just buried it deeper, where it festered like a bad rash. Things came to a head one night when I overheard him on the phone with his best friend Jake. I was in the kitchen, trying to figure out how to make a stir-fry without setting off the smoke alarm, when I heard him laugh and say, "Yeah, man, it's like having a live-in nurse. She's basically my mom now." I froze, the spatula hovering over the pan. "My mum? Really?" I wanted to storm in there and yell, "Excuse me, but your mum didn't sign up for this. Your mum isn't the one who hasn't had a full night's sleep in 6 months." But I didn't. I just stood there, staring at the wall, feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. That night, I cried in the shower for the first time in weeks. I'd been holding it together for so long, but hearing him say that, it broke something in me. I felt invisible, like all the sacrifices I'd made didn't matter because he didn't see them. Or worse, he saw them and didn't appreciate them. The next day, I tried to talk to him about it. I sat down on the edge of the bed and said, "Ethan, I need you to understand how hard this is for me." He nodded and said all the right things. "I appreciate everything you're doing. I don't know what I'd do without you." But it felt hollow, like he was reading from a script. After that, things just got worse. He started spending more time on his phone, texting someone, I didn't know who, and laughing at messages I wasn't allowed to see. He'd snap at me over little things, like if I forgot to buy his favourite brand of protein powder, or if the TV volume was too loud. And then there were the physical therapy sessions. At first, I was grateful for Sophie, his physical therapist. She was perky and optimistic, and she seemed to know what she was doing. But then I started noticing the way Ethan looked at her, the way he lit up when she walked into the room. It was subtle at first, but it was there, and it made my stomach twist in a way I couldn't ignore. The cracks were there, widening every day. I just didn't know how deep they went, or how much they would hurt when everything finally fell apart. Sophie was the kind of person who made you feel like you needed to apologise for existing. She was all sunshine and rainbows, with a smile so bright it could probably power a small city. And of course, she was gorgeous. Like, should be on the cover of a fitness magazine. Gorgeous. The first time I met her, she bounded into our apartment like she owned the place, her ponytail swinging and her yoga pants hugging every inch of her perfectly toned legs. I immediately felt like a potato in comparison. "Hi, sweetie," she chirped, giving Ethan a wave that was way too enthusiastic for 9 a.m. "Ready to get to work?" Ethan, who had been grumbling about how much he hated physical therapy just 5 minutes earlier, suddenly perked up like a puppy seeing its favourite toy. "Hey, Sophie, yeah, let's do this." I stood there, holding a mug of coffee that was now cold, feeling like I'd accidentally wandered into someone else's life. Sophie didn't even acknowledge me at first. She was too busy setting up her equipment and chatting with Ethan about his progress. When she finally turned to me, it was with a smile so fake it could have been made of plastic. "You must be the girlfriend," she said, extending a hand. "I'm Sophie." "Yeah, I figured," I said, shaking her hand and trying not to wince at her iron grip. "I'm the one who's been keeping him alive, so nice to meet you." She laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that made it clear she didn't think I was funny. "Well, you're in good hands now. I'll take it from here." And just like that, I was dismissed. The sessions became a regular thing. 3 times a week, sometimes more if Sophie had extra time. I tried to be supportive. Really, I did. I'd make snacks for them, offer to help with the exercises, and even sit in on a few sessions to cheer Ethan on. But it didn't take long for me to feel like a third wheel in my own home. Sophie had this way of making everything about her. If Ethan managed to lift his leg an inch higher than last time, she'd act like it was a personal victory. "We did it!" she'd exclaim, as if I hadn't been the one coaxing him through his exercises every night. And the way she touched him, always a hand on his shoulder, a pat on the back, a gentle adjustment that seemed to last a little too long, it made my skin crawl. I tried to brush it off. She's just doing her job, I told myself. She's a professional. This is what she's trained to do. But then I'd catch Ethan looking at her when he thought I wasn't watching, and the pit in my stomach would grow a little deeper. One day, after a particularly long session, Sophie stayed behind to chat with Ethan while I cleaned up the living room. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but I couldn't help overhearing their conversation. "You're making such great progress," Sophie said, her voice dripping with admiration. "I'm so proud of you." "Thanks," Ethan replied, sounding like a teenager with a crush. "I couldn't have done it without you." I froze, a pile of dirty towels in my arms. "What about me?" I wanted to scream. "I'm the one who's been here every step of the way." But I didn't say anything. I just stood there, feeling invisible while Sophie packed up her things and left with a cheerful, "See you next time, sweetie." After she was gone, I tried to talk to Ethan about it. "Do you think maybe Sophie's a little too hands-on?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. He shrugged. "She's just trying to help. You're not jealous, are you?" "Of course not," I lied. But the truth was, I was jealous. Not just of Sophie, but of the way Ethan looked at her. Like she was his hero, while I was just the person who made his protein shakes. The cracks were widening, and I didn't know how much longer I could hold everything together. Ethan's progress was slow at first, like watching grass grow or paint dry, except with more groaning and occasional swearing. But then, almost out of the nowhere, something clicked. He started regaining strength, little by little, and it felt like we were finally turning a corner. The first time he stood on his own, I cried. Like, full-on ugly cried. He laughed at me, but I didn't care. It was a victory, no matter how small. Sophie, of course, took all the credit. "See? This is what happens when you stick to the program," she said, beaming like she'd just cured cancer. I wanted to remind her that I was the one who'd been helping Ethan with his exercises every night. But I bit my tongue. This wasn't about me. It was about Ethan getting better. As his mobility improved, so did his mood. He started cracking jokes again, smiling more, and even flirting with me in that goofy way he used to. For the first time in months, I let myself hope that maybe, just maybe, we'd get through this. But with the progress came new challenges. Ethan was determined to get back to his old self as quickly as possible, and that meant pushing himself harder than he probably should have. There were days when he'd overdo it and end up in pain, and I'd have to talk him down from trying to run a marathon or whatever insane goal he'd set for himself. "You're not Superman," I told him one night after he'd spent an hour trying to walk without his cane and nearly face-planted into the coffee table. "I feel like I'm getting there, though," he said, grinning that lopsided grin that used to make my heart melt. Now, it just made me tired. The physical therapy sessions with Sophie became more intense, and so did the time they spent together. She started coming over on weekends, claiming it was to maximize his progress. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. They'd disappear into the living room for hours, laughing and talking while I stayed in the kitchen, pretending I wasn't listening. One afternoon, I came home early from work and found them sitting on the couch, heads bent close together as they looked at something on her phone. They didn't notice me at first, and I stood there in the doorway, feeling like an intruder in my own home. "Oh, hey," Ethan said when he finally saw me. "Sophie was just showing me some new exercises." "Right," I said, forcing a smile, "because the old ones weren't working." Sophie laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that made it clear she thought I was being ridiculous. "We're just trying to keep things fresh," she said, standing up and stretching, in a way that felt unnecessarily dramatic. "You know how it is." I didn't know, actually. What I did know was that I was starting to feel like an outsider in my own relationship. The final straw came a few weeks later, when Ethan announced that he wanted to start going to the gym with Sophie. "She says it'll help me build strength faster," he explained, like this was a totally normal thing to do with your physical therapist. "Isn't that what the sessions here are for?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "Yeah, but this is different," he said. "It's more hands-on." I wanted to scream. Instead, I said, "Sure, whatever you think is best," and walked away before he could see the tears in my eyes. The recovery was supposed to bring us closer together, but instead, it felt like it was pulling us apart. And the worst part, I didn't know how to stop it. It happened on a Tuesday. Of all the days for my life to fall apart, it had to be a Tuesday. I was at work trying to focus on a spreadsheet that might as well have been written in hieroglyphics when my phone buzzed with a text from Ethan. "Can't make it to dinner tonight. Sophie's helping me with some new exercises. Don't wait up." I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting into knots. New exercises at 7 p.m? Something didn't feel right, but I told myself I was being paranoid. Sophie was his physical therapist after all. This was her job. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. So, after work, I decided to swing by the gym on my way home. Just to check. You know, casually, like a normal, totally not crazy girlfriend. The gym was one of those fancy places with glass walls and neon lights, the kind where everyone looks like they've been photoshopped. I spotted Ethan and Sophie almost immediately. They were in the corner, near the weight machines, and they were laughing. Not just polite laughter either. This was full-on head thrown back, can't breathe laughter. I stood there, frozen, as Sophie reached out and playfully punched Ethan's arm. He grinned and said something I couldn't hear, but the way he looked at her, like she was the most fascinating person in the world, made my chest ache. And then it happened. Sophie leaned in, brushing a strand of hair out of her face, and Ethan's hand went to her waist. It was a small gesture, almost casual, but it was enough to make my heart stop. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. I don't know how long I stood there, watching them, before I finally turned and walked away. My hands were shaking and my vision blurred with tears, but I made it to my car before I completely fell apart. When I got home, Ethan was already there, sitting on the couch like nothing had happened. He looked up when I walked in, his expression a mix of surprise and guilt. "Hey," he said, his voice too casual. "I didn't think you'd be home so early." "Yeah," I said, my voice trembling. "I bet you didn't." He frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "I saw you at the gym with Sophie." For a moment, he just stared at me, his face unreadable. Then he sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "It's not what you think." "Really?" I snapped. "Because it looked like you were pretty cozy with her, or was that just part of your new exercises?" He didn't say anything, and that was all the confirmation I needed. "How long?" I asked, my voice breaking. "How long has this been going on?" "It's not like that," he said, but the way he avoided my eyes told me everything I needed to know. "Don't lie to me, Ethan," I said, my voice rising. "I've been here for you through everything. I've wiped your drool, I've cleaned up after you, I've put my life on hold for you, and this is how you repay me." He looked at me then, his expression a mix of guilt and defiance. "You're not the same person I fell in love with," he said quietly. The words hit me like a slap. "What?" "You're always so stressed," he said like that was some kind of excuse. "You're not fun anymore. Sophie gets me. She makes me feel like myself again." I stared at him, my mind racing. All the sacrifices I'd made, all the nights I'd spent worrying about him, all the times I'd put his needs before my own. And this was how it ended. With him choosing someone else because I wasn't fun enough. "Get out!" I said, my voice shaking with anger. "What?" "I said, get out," I repeated louder this time. "I'm done." He hesitated, like he was waiting for me to change my mind. But I just stood there, my arms crossed, until he finally grabbed his jacket and walked out the door. And just like that, it was over. The moment the door clicked shut behind Ethan, the floodgates opened. I crumpled to the floor, my back against the wall, and let the tears come. They weren't the pretty, delicate kind of tears you see in movies. No, these were ugly, heaving sobs that made my chest ache and my nose run like a faucet. I cried for what felt like hours, until my eyes were swollen and my throat was raw. When I finally ran out of tears, I just sat there, staring at the spot where Ethan's wheelchair used to be. It was gone now, along with all the medical supplies and protein shakes that had taken over our apartment. The space felt empty, but not in a good way. It was like the silence was pressing down on me, suffocating me. I knew I couldn't stay there, though, not in the apartment we'd shared. not surrounded by all the memories of what we used to be. So, I did the only thing I could think of. I started packing. I threw his stuff into boxes with a kind of manic energy, not caring if things got damaged or lost. His clothes, his books, his stupid collection of action figures, all of it went into the boxes. I even packed up the framed photo of us from our first vacation together, the one where we looked so happy and carefree. I didn't want to look at it anymore. When I was done, I called a moving company and arranged to have everything sent to his parents' house. I didn't trust myself to see him again, not after everything. The next few days were a blur. I called in sick to work and spent most of my time on the couch, wrapped in a blanket and binge-watching reality TV. I didn't have the energy to do much else. Every time I tried to eat, the food tasted like cardboard, and every time I tried to sleep, I'd wake up in the middle of the night, my heart racing and my mind replaying the moment I'd caught him with Sophie. I knew I couldn't keep living like this, though. So, I forced myself to get up, to shower, to put on real clothes instead of the same sweatpants I'd been wearing for days. It wasn't easy, but I did it. One of the hardest parts was telling people what had happened. My friends were shocked. Most of them had no idea things had gotten so bad between Ethan and me. They rallied around me, though, showing up with wine and chocolate and promises to help me through this. "You deserve better," my best friend Jess said one night, and as we sat on my couch, a half-empty bottle of wine between us. "Ethan's an idiot for letting you go." I wanted to believe her, but it was hard. I kept replaying his words in my head. "You're not the same person I fell in love with." Was he right? Had I changed so much that I wasn't even recognizable anymore? It took a while, but eventually I started to see things differently. I realized that I had changed, but not in the way Ethan thought. I'd become stronger, more resilient, more capable. I'd survived something that would have broken a lot of people, and that was something to be proud of. The breakup wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. And as hard as it was, I knew I'd get through it. After the initial shock of the breakup wore off, I decided it was time to reclaim my life. I wasn't going to sit around moping forever. I was going to live. And by live, I meant throwing myself into a series of questionable decisions that seemed like a good idea at the time. Spoiler alert, they were not. First up, kickboxing. I signed up for a class at the gym down the street, thinking it would be a great way to channel my anger and maybe get in shape. What I didn't account for was the fact that I have the coordination of a drunk giraffe. Within the first 5 minutes, I managed to trip over my own feet, accidentally punch the instructor in the arm, and knock over a water bottle with a roundhouse kick that was more enthusiastic than accurate. "You've got spirit," the instructor said, trying to sound encouraging. I could tell he was lying. Still, I kept at it. Every time I imagined Ethan's face on the punching bag, I felt a little better. By the end of the first month, I could actually hit the bag without falling over, which I considered a major victory. Next on my list of things to distract me from my crumbling personal life was online dating. Jess convinced me to download one of those apps where everyone's profile picture looks like they've been airbrushed by a professional. "It'll be fun," she said. "You might meet someone amazing." Spoiler, I did not meet someone amazing. My first date was with a guy named Greg, who spent the entire evening talking about his pet iguana. "His name is Spike," Greg said, showing me a blurry photo on his phone. "He's basically my soulmate." I nodded politely, wondering if it was too late to fake a sudden illness. Date number 2 was with a guy named Derek, who claimed to be a professional adventurer. Turns out that just meant he liked hiking and had a lot of Instagram followers. He spent most of the date trying to convince me to quit my job and join him on a life-changing journey to Patagonia. "I don't even like camping," I said, sipping my overpriced cocktail. "You just haven't found the right tent yet," he replied, completely serious. By the time date number 3 rolled around, I was starting to lose hope. His name was Mike, and he seemed normal enough. until he casually mentioned that he lived in his mum's basement and was between jobs. "I'm really into cryptocurrency," he said, leaning across the table. "You should let me invest your savings for you." I made an excuse to leave early and deleted the app as soon as I got home. In between all the dating disasters, I decided to adopt a dog. His name was Sir Barks-a-Lot, and he was a scrappy little terrier with a personality bigger than his body. He was also a bit of a troublemaker. Within the first week, he'd chewed up 2 pairs of shoes, destroyed a throw pillow, and somehow managed to get stuck in the laundry hamper. But he was also the best thing that had happened to me in a long time. He was always there when I needed him, whether I was crying over a pint of ice cream or just needed someone to cuddle with on the couch. He didn't care if I was a mess. He loved me anyway. The rebound phase wasn't pretty, but it was necessary. It was my way of figuring out who I was without Ethan, of rediscovering the parts of myself that I'd lost along the way. And even though there were plenty of missteps and embarrassing moments, I wouldn't change a thing. It was a Saturday morning when I ran into Ethan and Sophie. Of course, it had to be at my favourite coffee shop, the one place I thought was safe from the ghosts of my past. I was standing in line, mentally debating whether I could justify adding a chocolate croissant to my order, when I heard his voice. "Hey!" I froze, my hand halfway to my wallet. Slowly, I turned around, and there he was, Ethan, standing on his own 2 feet, looking healthier than he had in months. And right beside him, holding his hand like it was the most natural thing in the world, was Sophie. For a moment, I just stared at them, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. They looked happy, like they didn't have a care in the world. And why wouldn't they? They had each other. "Hi," I said finally, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "How have you been?" Ethan asked, his tone carefully neutral. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw my coffee in his face and tell him exactly how I'd been, how I'd spent nights crying myself to sleep, how I'd thrown myself into kickboxing and online dating and adopting a dog just to keep from falling apart. But I didn't. Instead, I forced a smile and said, "I have been good, really good." Sophia, of course, couldn't resist chiming in. "We've been great," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Ethan's made so much progress lately. It's been amazing to see." I wanted to punch her. Instead, I said, "That's great. I'm happy for you." The words tasted like ash in my mouth, but I meant them. Sort of. Ethan looked at me, his expression unreadable. "I am glad you're doing okay," he said. "I was worried about you." "Don't be," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "I'm fine. Better than fine, actually." There was an awkward silence, broken only by the sound of the barista calling out someone's order. Finally, Sophie said, "Well, we should probably get going. It was nice seeing you." "Yeah," I said, my smile frozen in place. "You too." As they walked away, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Anger, sadness, relief. But mostly, I felt proud of myself for not falling apart, for standing there and holding my head high, even though every fibre of my being wanted to curl up in a ball and disappear. When I got home, Sir Barks-a-Lot was waiting for me, wagging his tail like I'd been gone for years instead of 20 minutes. I scooped him up and buried my face in his fur, letting his warmth and unconditional love wash over me. "You're the only man I need," I told him, and for the first time in a long time, I believed it. After the coffee shop encounter, something shifted in me. It was like a switch had been flipped, and suddenly I wasn't just going through the motions anymore. I was truly living. I realised that I didn't need Ethan or anyone else to define my worth. I was enough, just as I was. The first step in my journey of self-discovery was reclaiming my space. I rearranged the apartment, getting rid of anything that reminded me of Ethan and replacing it with things that made me happy. I painted the walls a soft lavender, hung up artwork I'd been too shy to display before, and turned the spare room into a cozy reading nook. It was my sanctuary, a place where I could breathe and just be. I also started saying yes to things I would have normally avoided. When Jess invited me to a weekend yoga retreat, I went, even though I was pretty sure I'd spend most of it falling out of poses. Surprisingly, I loved it. There was something incredibly freeing about focusing on my breath and letting go of all the tension I'd been carrying around. I even tried my hand at painting, something I hadn't done since high school. At first, my attempts were, well, let's just say they weren't exactly gallery-worthy. But the more I painted, the more I enjoyed it. It didn't matter if the results were messy or imperfect. What mattered was that I was creating something, expressing myself in a way I hadn't in years. Sir Barks-a-Lot was my constant companion through it all. He was there for every late-night painting session, every yoga pose gone wrong, and every moment of self-doubt. He didn't care if I was a mess. He loved me unconditionally, and that was exactly what I needed. One of the biggest changes came when I decided to take a solo trip. I'd always wanted to visit the mountains, but I'd never had the courage to go alone. This time, I didn't let fear stop me. I packed a bag, loaded Sir Barks-a-Lot into the car, and hit the road. The trip was everything I needed and more. I hiked through breathtaking trails, watched the sunrise over misty peaks, and spent hours just sitting by a campfire, lost in thought. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. When I got back, I started writing again. Not just blog posts, but real honest-to-goodness writing. I poured my heart into it, sharing my journey of heartbreak, healing, and self-discovery. The response was overwhelming. People reached out to tell me how much my words had resonated with them, how my story had inspired them to take their own steps toward healing. It was then that I realized I wasn't just finding myself. I was creating myself. I was becoming the person I was always meant to be, someone strong and resilient and unapologetically herself. And you know what? It felt amazing. It's funny how life comes full circle. A year ago, I was sitting on the floor of my apartment, surrounded by the wreckage of a relationship I thought would last forever. Now, I'm standing in front of a room full of people, holding a copy of my book and trying not to cry. The book launch is everything I dreamed it would be, and more. The room is packed with friends, family, and even a few strangers who've been following my blog. There's a table piled high with copies of Life After Paralysis, his, not mine, and the air is buzzing with excitement. Jess is in the front row, grinning like a proud parent. Sir Barks-a-Lot is there too, wearing a little bow tie and looking adorably confused by all the attention. Even my mum flew in for the occasion, though she keeps whispering that I should have included more about my lovely childhood in the book. When it's time for me to speak, I take a deep breath and step up to the podium. The room falls silent, and for a moment, I'm overwhelmed by the weight of it all. This is it. The culmination of everything I've been through, everything I've fought for. Thank you all for being here. I begin, my voice steady despite the butterflies in my stomach. This book, it's not just my story. It's a story about resilience, about finding light in the darkest places, and about learning to love yourself even when it feels impossible. I glance down at the first page, where the dedication reads, "For anyone who's ever felt broken, you're not." A year ago, I didn't think I'd ever be standing here, I continue. I was lost, heartbroken, and convinced that I'd never be enough. But through all of the pain and the chaos, I found something I didn't even know I was looking for. Myself. The room erupts in applause, and I feel a lump rise in my throat. I take a moment to collect myself before continuing. This journey hasn't been easy, but it's been worth it. Every tear, every setback, every moment of doubt, it's all led me here. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the best revenge is living a life so full, you don't have time to look back. As I finish my speech, the room erupts in cheers. I step down from the podium, my heart swelling with pride and gratitude. Jess rushes over to hug me, and Sir Barks-a-Lot barks excitedly, as if he knows this is a moment worth celebrating. Later, as I sign copies of the book and chat with readers, I catch a glimpse of myself in the mirror. The woman staring back at me is confident, radiant, and completely at peace. She's not the same person who cried on the bathroom floor a year ago. She's stronger, wiser, and unapologetically herself. And you know what? She's enough. Months after the book launch, life feels like it's finally settled into a rhythm I can dance to. Not the frantic, offbeat kind of rhythm I used to stumble through, but something smoother, more intentional. I wake up most mornings with a sense of purpose, something I hadn't felt in years. Sir Barks-a-Lot is still my faithful alarm clock, his wet nose nudging me awake at the crack of dawn. And I don't even mind anymore. Well, most days. The blog has grown into something I never imagined. What started as a way to vent my frustrations and document my healing has turned into a community. People write to me from all over the world, sharing their own stories of heartbreak, resilience, and self-discovery. It's humbling, really, to know that my words have touched so many lives. I've even started hosting virtual workshops, helping others navigate their own journeys of healing. Who would have thought? One of the most unexpected twists in this whole saga has been the podcast. Yes, a podcast. Jess convinced me to start one, arguing that my voice, both literally and figuratively, needed to be heard. At first I was terrified. Talking into a microphone felt like standing naked in front of a crowd. But once I got over the initial awkwardness, I realised how much I loved it. Each episode feels like a conversation with a friend, and the listeners have become like an extended family. Work has taken on a new meaning too. I quit my old job a few months ago, trading spreadsheets for storytelling. It was a leap of faith, but one I don't regret. Writing has become my anchor, my way of making sense of the world. And the best part? I get to do it on my own terms. No more deadlines imposed by someone else, no more stifling office politics. Just me, my laptop, and a bottomless cup of coffee. Even my love life has taken a turn for the better. Remember that guy from the yoga retreat? Turns out he's not just good at downward dog. His name is Alex, and he's kind, funny, and refreshingly normal. No parkour stunts, no pet iguanas, just a genuine connection that feels easy and real. We're taking things slow, and for the first time in a long time, I'm okay with that. But the real triumph? It's not the book, or the blog, or even the podcast. It's the way I feel when I look in the mirror now. The woman staring back at me is someone I'm proud of. She's been through hell and come out the other side, not just intact, but stronger. She's learned to laugh at herself, to embrace her flaws, and to find joy in the little things. The other day, I ran into Ethan again. He was at the park with Sophie and they looked fine. Not happy, not miserable, just fine. And you know what? I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, not even a flicker of regret. Just a quiet sense of gratitude for how far I've come. As I walked away, Sir Barks-a-Lot trotting happily beside me, I realised something. This is my triumph. Not because I've achieved some grand, life-altering success, but because I've found peace. I've learned to love myself, to trust myself, and to believe that I'm enough. And really, what's more triumphant than that?